On a cold January morning in 2021, the United States carried out a rare act, the execution of a woman. But this isn't just a story of crime and punishment. It's the haunting journey of a woman born into brutality, shaped by unspeakable abuse, and consumed by a mind unraveling from trauma. Her name was Lisa Marie Montgomery, and what she did shocked the nation. This is the story of America's last executed woman, and the justice system that many believe failed her long before she ever committed a crime. Before we begin, if you appreciate deep investigations into true crime cases like this one, painstakingly researched and told with respect to the victims, the law, and the truth, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell icon so that you not to miss our next upload. On February 27, 1968, in the snow-dusted town of Melbourne, Kansas, Lisa Marie Montgomery took her first breath, a child born into a world that would systematically strip away every semblance of safety, every flicker of hope, until all that remained was a fractured psyche shaped by unspeakable cruelty. By the time she turned 11, June 1979, her stepfather had already begun his relentless campaign of sexual and physical abuse, a horror her mother not only ignored but actively facilitated, locking Lisa in closets for hours, beating her with a belt buckle until the walls were speckled with blood, then sending her to school the next day with long sleeves and a hollow stare. But the worst was yet to come. By 1981, her own mother had trafficked her to men who paid in cash, turning the family home into a nightmare Lisa couldn't escape, a cycle of violation so relentless that psychologists would later argue it rewired her brain. Lisa Montgomery didn't just carry the trauma of her childhood into adulthood, it followed her like a shadow, quietly shaping every part of her life while the world around her kept moving, unaware of how fractured she had become. On paper she appeared to be trying, marriage, children, a home. But under the surface, Lisa was coming apart. Her first marriage was to Carl Bowman, a relationship that quickly turned abusive. She had 4 children with him, but the home was filled with chaos and volatility. Lisa's mental health was already in crisis, though no one called it that back then. Carl would later describe moments where Lisa seemed emotionally blank, unresponsive, lost in a daze like her mind had simply left. It wasn't just mood swings. There were periods of emotional collapse, times where she couldn't even hold conversations, and episodes that would today be recognized as dissociation, a trauma response where the brain detaches from reality to survive. After their divorce, Lisa lost custody of her children. That loss shattered her. It stripped away one of the only roles in life where she felt a sense of purpose, being a mother. And with no therapy, no intervention, and no support system to hold her up, Lisa quickly began losing touch with reality. Her second marriage to Kevin Montgomery didn't save her either. It only offered a new backdrop for her deteriorating mental state. During those years, Lisa began telling people she was pregnant, not once but over and over. She told family, neighbors, even people online. She would describe the details of her supposed pregnancy, due dates, gender guesses, name choices. And sometimes her body would even show signs, bloating, tenderness, morning sickness, all symptoms that can occur in a rare condition known as pseudocyesis, or false pregnancy. But there was never a baby. At first some believed her. Others were confused. But eventually those closest to her began to notice the pattern, and the fact that no child ever arrived. These weren't calculated lies. They were delusions. Lisa believed them. She wasn't pretending for sympathy. She was living in a mental world that blurred fiction and reality. Psychologists would later explain that this obsession with pregnancy wasn't random. It was rooted in her lifelong trauma. Lisa was trying to create a life that loved her back. A baby, in her mind, would mean safety, identity, connection, the very things she never had. And then came the breakdowns. Lisa would spiral into crying fits that lasted for hours. She'd speak in circles, forget what day it was, lose track of reality entirely. Her family members would later describe her as unreachable during those episodes. She couldn't focus, couldn't reason. Sometimes she'd disappear into herself completely, rocking back and forth, mumbling. It wasn't just mental illness, it was a complete collapse of the boundaries between thought, memory, and reality. By the early 2000s, Lisa Montgomery was barely functioning. Yet still, no one stepped in with real help. Her behaviors were often brushed off as strange or attention-seeking. Her suffering wasn't taken seriously. But behind closed doors she was crumbling, and it was getting worse. Eventually, in the lead-up to her arrest, Lisa underwent a full psychiatric evaluation. What those doctors found shocked even seasoned mental health experts. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, explaining the intense shifts between energy and depression, the impulsive behaviors, the lack of emotional regulation. She also had complex PTSD, the result of sustained, repeated trauma starting in early childhood. And perhaps most significantly, neurological imaging revealed damage to her temporal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for managing memory, emotions, and decision-making. This damage likely came from repeated head injuries during her years of abuse. It was physical proof of what trauma had done to her brain. One of her psychologists, a veteran in forensic mental health, said bluntly, "Lisa Montgomery's trauma history is the most severe I've seen in over 3 decades of clinical work. Her brain is physically and emotionally broken." Her condition also included dissociative features, episodes in which she would mentally disconnect from the world around her, retreating into alternate versions of herself. One moment she'd be Lisa, the next someone else entirely. This wasn't make-believe. This was her mind's way of protecting her from memories and emotions too painful to face. She had spent a lifetime learning how to disappear from her own pain. Yet despite all this, the psychiatric records, the brain scans, the decades of documented trauma, Lisa never received consistent treatment. No hospitalizations. No long-term therapy. No medication regimen. The system never caught her in time. Instead, she was left to drift further into a fractured reality, one where fantasy and desperation bled into each other until there was no way to tell what was real, and what her mind had created to survive. And while she lived in this suspended state of delusion and emotional confusion, the world kept turning. People saw her as odd, unstable, even manipulative, but few if any saw her as dangerously unwell. Fewer still looked closely enough to ask why. Lisa Montgomery wasn't just mentally ill. She was collapsing. Her identity, her grasp on reality, her ability to distinguish right from wrong, all of it had been corroded by a lifetime of abuse, untreated illness, and a silence that had followed her since childhood. And in the winter of 2004, that silence was about to end, in the most tragic way imaginable. It was the morning of December 16, 2004, in the small farming town of Skidmore, Missouri, a quiet community tucked deep in Nottoway County, with fewer than 300 residents. That Thursday began like any other. But by afternoon, Skidmore would become the center of one of the most horrific crimes in recent American memory. Bobbie Jo Stinnett, 23 years old, was 8 months pregnant and known by everyone in town as kind, gentle, and full of promise. She and her husband Zeb ran a small kennel breeding rat terriers. Bobbie Jo was also active on online dog forums, where she made digital friends who shared her passion for animals. One of those digital friends was someone calling herself Darlene Fisher. They had exchanged several messages about a potential puppy adoption. They talked about dogs, family life, and pregnancy. But what Bobbie Jo didn't know was that Darlene Fisher didn't exist. It was a false identity created by Lisa Montgomery, who had grown obsessed with pregnancy stories and birth announcements online. She had even gone as far as crafting a backstory for her fake persona, a woman who recently lost a baby and was looking for a new pet. On that day, Lisa Montgomery climbed into her car and began a 175-mile drive from her home in Melbourne, Kansas, toward Bobbie Jo's house in Skidmore. She brought with her a rope and a kitchen knife. She arrived just before noon. Bobbie Jo, believing she was meeting a fellow dog enthusiast, welcomed her into her modest home on West Elm Street. What happened next would leave a town traumatized and a nation horrified. At some point during their conversation, perhaps while admiring the puppies or talking about motherhood, Lisa Montgomery attacked. She wrapped a pink neon rope around Bobbie Jo's neck and strangled her until she passed out, but Bobbie Jo regained consciousness mid-assault and fought back. The struggle left signs of a violent confrontation. Clumps of hair torn out, furniture knocked over, scratch marks on Lisa's arms. But Lisa overpowered her, this time strangling her to death. With Bobbie Jo now lifeless on the floor, Lisa retrieved a kitchen knife from her bag and began to cut. She performed a crude cesarean section on Bobbie Jo's abdomen, removing the unborn baby girl. The incision was messy, jagged, evidence of someone with no medical training attempting a surgery meant only for sterile operating rooms. But somehow the baby survived. Lisa wrapped the infant in a blanket, cleaned herself up in the kitchen sink, and calmly exited the house with the newborn child in her arms. Later that afternoon, Bobbie Jo's mother, Becky Harper, arrived for a scheduled visit. She found her daughter lying in a pool of blood. Bobbie Jo was unresponsive, her stomach grotesquely opened, and the baby was gone. In shock, Becky dialed 911. Her voice on the recorded call was frantic and trembling. "It looks like her stomach has exploded. She's 8 months pregnant and the baby is gone." The 911 dispatcher, at first unsure of what Becky meant, soon realized the full horror of what had occurred. A homicide and abduction. An Amber Alert was immediately issued for the missing newborn, despite authorities not even knowing her name yet. Meanwhile, Lisa had driven home to Kansas. She called her husband Kevin and told him that she had given birth while out shopping. She introduced him to the baby girl, whom she named Abigail, and even invited friends over to meet the new addition. But what Lisa didn't realize was that the digital footprint she left behind was already unraveling her story. Authorities quickly traced the Darlene Fisher email address back to Lisa's IP address. Investigators obtained a court order, confirmed her route via phone records and digital communication, and within 24 hours the FBI and local police were knocking on her door. Inside the house, Lisa was found holding the infant girl in her arms, pretending she had just given birth the day before. But when confronted, her story began to crack. The baby was quickly taken to a hospital and confirmed to be Bobbie Jo Stinnett's daughter. Miraculously, the child was unharmed. Lisa Montgomery was arrested on December 17, 2004. And the nation, still in shock, watched as the horrifying details emerged. Bobbie Jo Stinnett had been murdered in her own home, by a woman who fabricated an entire identity, drove across state lines and committed one of the most shocking acts of fetal abduction in U.S. history. The baby, named Victoria Jo Stinnett by her family, would go on to be raised by her father Zeb, far from the spotlight of media attention. As law enforcement processed the crime scene and examined Lisa's behavior, one question began to surface louder than any other. Was this the act of a cold-blooded killer, or a woman completely unmoored from reality? The investigation would uncover even more disturbing truths, not just about the murder, but about what Lisa had been hiding, and how her mind may have truly believed that what she did was the only way to be a mother again. In October 2007, nearly 3 years after Bobbie Jo Stinnett's brutal murder, the case of Lisa Marie Montgomery came to trial in a federal courtroom in Kansas City, Missouri. What unfolded wasn't just a prosecution of a single, gruesome act. It was a collision between cold facts and emotional complexity, between the horror of what Lisa had done, and the shattered mind behind it. Montgomery was charged with federal kidnapping resulting in death, a capital offense under U.S. law. Because she had crossed state lines to abduct the unborn baby, the crime fell under federal jurisdiction. If convicted, Lisa faced only two possibilities: life in prison without parole or the federal death penalty. From the outset, the prosecution focused sharply on intent and premeditation. Assistant U.S. Attorney Matt Whitworth laid out a meticulous chain of events: Lisa's months-long digital impersonation of Darlene Fisher, her deceptive communications with Bobbie Jo, the pre-planned drive to Missouri, and the tools, rope and knife, she carried with her on the day of the murder. To the prosecution, these weren't the desperate actions of an unstable woman. They were the calculated moves of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. They played emails in court, shown with timestamps, proving Lisa had researched cesarean procedures and fetal abduction cases in the months leading up to the crime. Witnesses from her family and friends testified that Lisa had faked multiple pregnancies before and had told people in late 2004 that she was due in December. The government painted her as a manipulator, someone who constructed an entire false pregnancy to cover up her plan to steal a child. One line, pulled from the trial transcript, echoed across headlines and coverage. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She planned it. She lied about it. She hid it. And when it was over, she covered it up. But the defense team told a radically different story. Led by attorney Frederick Dutchert, they argued that Lisa Montgomery wasn't a cold-blooded killer. She was a severely mentally ill woman, whose brain had been broken by a lifetime of abuse and untreated trauma. They brought in expert witnesses, psychiatrists, neurologists, and trauma specialists who testified about Lisa's diagnoses: complex PTSD, bipolar disorder, depression, dissociative episodes, and temporal lobe brain damage caused by repeated beatings throughout her youth. They explained that Lisa's behavior, including her delusions about pregnancy and childbirth, were symptoms of pseudopsoriasis, a rare condition where a woman truly believes she is pregnant despite medical evidence to the contrary. Her mind, they said, was deeply fragmented. She wasn't capable of fully understanding reality, let alone criminal intent. But there was a problem. The defense's presentation of her trauma and mental illness was disjointed, incomplete, and, critics would later argue, fatally weak. Key witnesses, including family members who could have confirmed her lifelong abuse, were not called. Reports suggest that Lisa's defense team failed to fully investigate or present the most compelling evidence of her psychological collapse. Even Lisa's half-sister, Diane Mattingly, who had been removed from the home as a child due to abuse and later became a vocal advocate for Lisa, was never contacted to testify. And though the jury heard about Lisa's mental health, the prosecution countered with their own psychiatric expert, who claimed Lisa had personality disorders, not psychosis or dissociation, and therefore knew her actions were wrong. That detail was critical, because under U.S. law, insanity as a legal defense hinges not on whether a person is mentally ill, but whether they understood right from wrong at the time of the crime. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of federal kidnapping resulting in death. And during the penalty phase, after hearing testimony from both sides, the jury again voted unanimously: Lisa Montgomery would be sentenced to death. The reaction was immediate and deeply divided. Some Americans, including many in Skidmore and within law enforcement, saw justice. To them, Lisa had taken an innocent woman's life and stolen a child. The brutality of the act, the rope, the knife, the deception, was too horrific to ignore. For those who viewed the case through the lens of accountability, the death sentence was not just legal, it was moral. But others, including legal scholars, mental health advocates, and trauma survivors, were shaken by the decision. They believed the system had failed Lisa twice: first by allowing her to live through a childhood of unthinkable abuse with no intervention, and then again by refusing to fully account for how that trauma had shaped the adult she became. National organizations, including the National Alliance on Mental Illness and the ACLU, later released statements criticizing the trial as a miscarriage of justice for someone whose brain had been damaged by torture before she was ever old enough to understand it. In the years that followed, Lisa Montgomery's case would become a focal point in debates over mental illness and the death penalty, especially for women who survive lifelong trauma. But as far as the federal government was concerned in 2007, the matter was settled. Lisa Montgomery had been found sane, guilty, and worthy of the most extreme punishment the justice system can deliver. And so she returned to prison, sentenced to await her execution, in silence. After her conviction and death sentence in 2007, Lisa Montgomery was transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Carswell, Texas, a specialized facility that houses female inmates with severe medical and psychiatric needs. Though technically a prison, FMC Carswell is unlike most. Behind its razor wire and administrative buildings sits a complex that holds some of the most psychologically vulnerable women in the federal system. And there, Lisa would remain, for the next 14 years. Those who worked closely with her said Lisa became increasingly withdrawn. Her days were marked by long silences, periods of confusion, and heavy doses of psychiatric medication. Prison staff noted she would sometimes talk to herself, or retreat into blank stares that could last hours. At times she couldn't recall what day it was, or even why she was on death row. The facility's medical staff treated her for major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, and complex PTSD, but her condition rarely stabilized for long. Outside the prison walls, her legal team refused to give up. Her attorneys filed appeal after appeal, in circuit courts, in federal courts, and eventually with the Supreme Court, arguing that the justice system had failed to recognize the full scope of her trauma and the extent of her brain damage. Medical experts, including neurologists, submitted declarations showing that Lisa had structural brain abnormalities, particularly in the temporal lobe, an area responsible for impulse control, emotional regulation, and memory. MRI scans and psychological evaluations supported their claims. Lisa wasn't just mentally ill, she was permanently impaired. More chilling, though, were the detailed affidavits from childhood witnesses. Family members and neighbors testified, some for the first time, about the abuse Lisa endured as a child. She had been raped repeatedly by her stepfather, burned, choked, and trafficked by her own mother in exchange for money and plumbing work. One family member described Lisa's early life as a dungeon with no windows. Another said, she was never safe. Not once. Human rights organizations took notice. Groups like the American Civil Liberties Union (ACLU), the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and Amnesty International condemned her sentence. They argued that executing a woman who had suffered such unrelenting trauma, without ever receiving psychological intervention or protection during childhood, was not justice but cruelty. By 2020, her case had drawn the attention of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which issued a rare public appeal to the U.S. government. "Do not execute Lisa Montgomery," they wrote. "This is a woman whose life has been defined by torture, and whose mind has been broken by it." Still, the courts remained unmoved. Her legal limbo stretched across 4 presidential terms, tangled in a web of legal reviews, shifting public sentiment and political silence. There were moments of hope, moments when stays were granted or hearings reopened, but every window seemed to close just as quickly. Inside FMC Carswell, Lisa marked time in silence. Her letters to her sister and legal team were often disjointed, sometimes childlike. In interviews, her attorney said she didn't fear death, but she didn't understand it either. To her, the idea of execution wasn't terrifying, it was confusing. She believed she might go away and come back. That one day someone might still let her hold her baby again. For 14 years, Lisa Montgomery sat on death row, a woman whose mind was slowly dissolving under the weight of trauma and punishment. Her supporters argued that she needed treatment, not a needle. Her critics insisted the brutality of her crime demanded nothing less than the ultimate penalty. But one thing was certain: Lisa's case had become more than just about a single act of violence. It had become a symbol, a painful reflection of how the American justice system handles women, trauma survivors, and the mentally ill. And as the final days of her life approached, that symbol would be tested in a way the nation hadn't seen in nearly 7 decades. On the night of January 12, 2021, as most of America settled into the numb routine of pandemic winter, inside the heavily fortified walls of the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana, final preparations were underway for a federal execution, the first woman to be executed by the U.S. government in nearly 70 years. Lisa Marie Montgomery, now 52 years old, was transported under heavy guard from FMC Carswell in Texas to Indiana just days earlier. The decision had come swiftly under the outgoing administration of President Donald Trump, whose Department of Justice had resumed federal executions in 2020 after a 17-year hiatus. Lisa's date of death was set, and despite mounting legal challenges and global outcry, the clock continued to tick down. Her attorneys filed urgent last-minute appeals. They argued she was too mentally ill to be executed, that she was living in a psychotic state, incapable of understanding her punishment or why she was facing it, an essential requirement under federal law. Even her spiritual advisor, Reverend Kelly Henry, testified that Lisa believed the execution was some sort of elaborate game, that she would wake up back in her cell when it was over. But every court, including the U.S. Supreme Court, denied her stay. As the hour approached midnight, Lisa was placed under observation in a holding cell a short walk from the death chamber. Witnesses reported her demeanor as quiet, almost unaware. She spoke softly to the guards. She asked if her hair looked okay. She seemed calm, not out of acceptance but disconnection. Years of institutionalization and heavy psychiatric medication had dulled the finality of what was happening. At 1:31 a.m. on January 13, 2021, Lisa was strapped to a gurney inside the death chamber. The blinds separating her from the witnesses were drawn. A U.S. Marshal asked if she had any last words. Her voice, barely audible through the microphone, broke the silence. No. With that, the execution began. Lisa Montgomery was injected with a single dose of pentobarbital, a powerful barbiturate used in federal executions. Within seconds, her chest began to rise and fall rapidly. Her lips turned blue. A minute later, she stopped moving. At 1:45 a.m., she was declared dead. The room fell silent. Outside the prison, a small crowd of activists and journalists stood vigil in freezing temperatures. Some held candles. Others wept. Among them were mental health advocates, attorneys, and survivors of trauma who believed her execution was not justice. It was a societal failure playing out in its most final form. Within minutes of her death, international headlines erupted. The United Nations Human Rights Office, which had pleaded with the Trump administration to halt the execution, issued a public statement condemning the act. Dozens of advocacy groups across the globe called it a profound moral injustice. Not because Lisa had not committed a crime, but because they believed she had never truly been sane since childhood. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice released a brief statement confirming her execution, reiterating the court's conclusion that Lisa knew what she was doing when she murdered Bobbie Jo Stinnett and stole her child. The victim's family, largely silent through the years, did not make a public statement, perhaps because nothing, not even death, could undo what had been taken from them. Lisa Montgomery became the first woman executed by the U.S. federal government since 1953, and the only one in the modern era to be put to death by lethal injection at the federal level. To some, it was the rightful conclusion to a horrific crime. To others, it was a final, irreversible act of state violence against a woman who had never been given a chance to heal. But to history, her execution would mark more than the end of a case. It would ignite a fierce and ongoing debate about mental illness, female criminality, and what mercy truly means under American law. This story doesn't end with a gurney or a courtroom decision. It ends with us, asking ourselves the hardest questions. What do you think? Should Lisa Montgomery have been executed? Did the justice system get it right, or miss the full truth? Share your thoughts below. Whether you agree or disagree, your voice matters. Let's talk about justice. Let's talk about trauma. Let's talk about what mercy looks like when it's needed the most. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe these conversations need to be heard. Because stories like this aren't just about the past. They're about the choices we make, together, for the future.